Hello, my name is Arthur. I'm a doctoral intern at Drexel's Counseling Center, and I'll be walking you through our Anxiety Toolbox workshop. There's a total of 3 sessions for Anxiety Toolbox, including today. There's also a student workbook associated with this workshop. Please take a moment now to access that workbook and keep it open alongside this video as we move through it. At certain points along today and the remaining 3 sessions, I'll be asking you to pause the video and complete certain exercises as we go. Now, I mentioned there's 3 sessions for this workshop, and I recommend spacing these sessions out by about a week or so. This will be an optimal amount of time for you to practice the skills that we'll be introducing. And practice really is key here. These are coping skills that we're going to be learning and developing in this workshop. And like any skill, practice really is key to learning how to use it. And so I can't really emphasize enough the importance of practice when it comes to these or really any other skills. So that's a really basic summary of what this seminar is about. Why don't we get started? Today we're going to talk about several topics. We're going to discuss the difference between stress and anxiety, and we'll talk about how stress can actually be a good thing. We're going to talk about anxiety, what it is and what's happening in your body. We'll also talk about various aspects of anxiety and how different types of symptoms interact with one another. We'll practice a breathing exercise that you can use to manage your anxiety symptoms, and we'll end with a discussion on sleep, how it can impact your mood and functioning, and we'll give you some tips for better sleep. Before we dive in, let me highlight that in your workbook, you'll find the information sheets on much of what we'll be talking about throughout this seminar. Feel free to take notes on those worksheets if you want to, but no pressure, it's not required. Okay, so let's start by talking about what stress and anxiety are. Oftentimes we use the term stress and anxiety interchangeably, but they're actually different. Most living beings experience stress at some point. Stress is the brain's response to any demand. It is a reaction to some specific challenge or situation. Typically, with normative stress, the arousal response goes away as you deal with the challenge. Additionally, with stress, some level of arousal is normal and in some situations can actually be motivational. The stress-motivation relationship has been described by the Yerkes-Dodson law, or inverted U model. Basically, our best performance is achieved when we experience a moderate level of pressure or stress. However, when we experience too much or too little pressure, our performance is negatively affected. For example, some stress before a test or a deadline may motivate you to study, but too much stress can be overwhelming and have a negative effect on attention, memory, and problem solving. Bottom line, not feeling any stress may inhibit motivation, and having too much can diminish performance, but a moderate level of stress is actually good for motivation. Anxiety, on the other hand, usually doesn't go away and usually is not motivational. Anxiety and stress often look similar and share many of the same physical symptoms. We'll be discussing the physical symptoms of anxiety later. But anxiety can occur with chronic stress, a major stressful event, or it can occur when there is no identifiable stressor. With anxiety, you still have stress long after the actual event has passed. Anxiety can take many different forms and may or may not be diagnosable. For more information about the various anxiety diagnoses, see page 37 of the appendix in your student workbook. For now, we're going to take a broad look at stress and anxiety. You can turn to page 6 in your workbook as we review these differences. Moving on, let's shift a little bit and talk about what's going on in your body when you experience stress or anxiety. A big part of anxiety has to do with our physiological responses to stressors. Some of you may have heard of the fight, flight, or freeze response. That's what we're talking about here. Essentially, the most primitive part of our brain, our amygdala, has an evolutionary basis in protecting us from danger. Our amygdala can be thought of as a switch for anxiety. Back in the day when we were living in the wilderness and needed protection from animals and other predators, this part of our brain adapted and switched on to help us to either fight the predator or flee from the situation. Researchers later acknowledged that in addition to fighting or fleeing, we may also respond by freezing when we perceive danger. It's not as commonly discussed, but it's also an adaptive response. The freeze response is more of an automatic shutdown and functioning, like being a deer caught in headlights. So let's think about this. If you were hiking, confronted by a dangerous animal, and the amygdala, the anxiety switch, switched on, what might you feel happening in your body? Let's scroll to page 7 in the workbook to talk more about this. Take a look at the symptoms listed and put a check mark next to the ones you've experienced yourself. Pause the video if you need to and resume when you're ready. Maybe some of these sound familiar to you. These are the fight or flight symptoms triggered by your amygdala. They're the physical or physiological symptoms of anxiety, the way our bodies physiologically respond to anxiety today is pretty much the same as how early humans responded to threats back in the day. But in general, the threats we face today are different. When was the last time you had to escape a dangerous animal, for example? Consider the anxiety-provoking threats or situations that we face today. Tests, social interactions, going on a date, meeting new people, and the list goes on. So we have these perceived threats, and our amygdala immediately goes to work as if our lives were actually in danger. The threats are different, but our brains react just like they did when we were early humans. It's like a false alarm that's constantly going off. The fight, flight, or freeze system is getting mistriggered in response to today's daily non-life-threatening situations. So where the reaction used to be adaptive when we had to fight or flee from predators, it no longer is adaptive when it leads us to flee from tests or potential new friends or dates. Actually, this response can become maladaptive. Essentially, what's happening now is that we're running away from danger all day long and tiring ourselves out. Our amygdala gets stuck in the on mode because our brains do not distinguish between life-threatening and non-life-threatening stressors, and this creates anxiety. The amygdala learns that this level of arousal and anxiety, this constant on mode, is the new norm, and the amygdala adapts and adopts this new level of anxiety in our bodies, and this is why we may feel anxious all the time. So the fight, flight, or freeze response triggered by the amygdala contributes to physiological symptoms of anxiety. But these are only one component of a greater picture of anxiety. Let's get a fuller picture. As we talk about anxiety, we'll be using a specific model called cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. This model is evidence-based in treating anxiety. The CBT model focuses on interactions between symptoms in 3 areas: thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. When we talk about anxiety, we add physiological or physical sensations to this model because, as we just discussed, physical sensations are a major part of the anxiety experience. So in these 3 sessions, we'll focus on 4 symptom clusters: physical, emotional, behavioral, and cognitive responses. Go ahead and scroll to page 8 in your workbook for a visual of the model and an example. This diagram illustrates how each of these symptom categories interact with one another and impact one another. This CBT model is a fundamental part of this anxiety seminar, and we'll frequently refer to this diagram and model throughout these 3 seminar sessions. At the top of the page, you fill in a situation, something that happened or an occasion during which you felt anxious. So in this example, we can see that in the situation all the way at the top of the page, it says when, where, what, with whom, and what did you feel anxious about. So in this example, A student invited me to a party in my residence hall, but I didn't know her very well and felt anxious about going. So there's the situation. Now let's take a look at the 4 symptom clusters below that came up in this example as a response to this situation. So let's start with the top box, physical. So when anxious, what physical sensations did you experience? What did you notice in your body? In this example, heart racing, tight chest, and shallow breathing. These are some pretty common anxiety symptoms that show up physically. Let's go to the right side now to the cognitive symptom cluster. And the prompt here is, what went through your mind when you felt anxious? And what did that say or mean about you or the situation? So in this example, I won't know anyone at the party and will feel awkward. No one will like me because I'm so socially awkward. I won't have fun. But if I say no, this person won't like me and I wouldn't make friends. Okay? Now let's take a look at the bottom box, behavioral. And the prompt here is, what was your first instinct or automatic response? What did you do or what did you avoid doing at that time? In this example, my first instinct was to say no, but instead I said I'll think about it. I never got back to her and didn't go to the party. And let's take a look at the left box now, the emotional symptom cluster, with the prompt being, what emotions came up for you when you felt anxious? And in this example, anxious, scared, ashamed, and lonely. So you'll notice that there are arrows pointing from each one of these boxes to each of the other boxes. And that's just to indicate that each of these symptom clusters impacts and is impacted by the other. So before completing your own personal, simple cross-sectional formulation, it's important to acknowledge that for some of us, this activity, thinking about and writing down our anxiety symptoms, may increase our current anxiety. And this is totally normal, especially if we're accustomed to avoiding thinking about it. Just know that as we spend time talking about anxiety in a constructive manner, the intensity of the anxious feelings will most likely begin to decrease. And at the same time, we'll be practicing our new tools to manage the anxiety. So now we're actually going to get into it. Looking at the blank diagram on page 9, please take a minute to think about a situation where you felt anxious and write in the corresponding symptoms of anxiety that you personally experienced. If you're having trouble thinking of symptoms, see pages 10 and 11 for examples of symptoms. You can pause now and take a few minutes to write these down and resume the video when you're ready. So we may have just increased our anxiety symptoms by actively focusing on an anxiety-provoking situation instead of avoiding it. Let's learn a new skill for our anxiety toolbox. One of the most effective coping strategies you can use for anxiety symptoms, particularly the physical ones, is to use deep breathing and relaxation techniques. Remember how we talked about the fight, flight, or freeze response? This response activates one part of your nervous system. It sends oxygen to your arms and legs so that you're prepared to fight or flee. However, less oxygen is sent to your thinking brain in our prefrontal cortex, which makes it difficult to think clearly. Deep breathing and relaxation activate another part of your nervous system. It sends a signal to your brain to tell the anxious part of you that you're safe and that you don't need to use the fight, flight, or freeze response. Deep breathing gets more oxygen to the thinking brain. Also, by addressing the physical fight, flight, and freeze symptoms directly, you're freeing up mental energy to address other symptoms. Before we practice the deep breathing, let's take a moment to check in on our anxiety level. This is like taking a thermometer reading of our anxiety. We're going to rate our anxiety on a scale from 1 to 10, with 1 being very low to non-existent, and 10 being the most severe anxiety you've ever experienced or can imagine experiencing. Please jot down what your number is right now. Okay, so let's learn this new skill of deep breathing. I'll model it first and then guide you through it and provide you some time for your own to practice. If this is too uncomfortable to do right now, just follow along and you can try at a later point. Now, I'll explain it first and then show you. I know it sounds simple, but it actually takes some concentration. So placing one hand on your stomach and one hand on your chest, we want to feel the hand on your stomach moving in and out, but the hand on your chest shouldn't be moving much at all. Taking a deep breath in through your nose, counting in your mind, 1, 2, 3, 4. Imagine using the air we breathe in to push against our hand on our stomach. Holding for a count of 2, then breathing through your mouth for 1, 2, 3, 4, and pausing before we start again. So it'll look something like this. So the top hand is going to be staying relatively still, where the hand on our abdomen is going to be rising and falling. And this is what's referred to as abdominal breathing. And it's just a way of getting more oxygen into our lungs and letting us to breathe a little more deeply. So now let's give it a try. Breathing in for a count of 4, holding for a count of 2, and breathing out for a count of 4. So let's try just a few more cycles like this. In for a count of 4, holding for a count of 2, and breathing out for a count of 4. Let's practice just like this for another minute or so. Okay, so now let's take another thermometer reading. Please rate your current level of anxiety on a scale from 1 to 10. Did you notice a shift in the numbers? I encourage you to keep practicing this simple yet powerful tool. It's something you can continue to practice anywhere since it's quiet and we always need to breathe. Now, to wrap up today's session, let's talk about sleep. Good sleep, along with physical activity and good nutrition, forms the foundation of basic physical and mental health. Without this foundation, you may find you're more vulnerable to anxiety symptoms. So let's talk about sleep. Lots of important things happen in your brain and your body while you sleep. The research shows that while you're sleeping, your brain is hard at work forming the pathways necessary for learning. Sleep deprivation will impact your mood, your energy, your grades, and your ability to focus and concentrate in class and on homework. Research shows that you need 7 to 8 hours of sleep consistently every night to be well rested and to perform optimally. As we all may know, in college it's common for people to stay up late, pull all-nighters, catch up on sleep later. Does this sound familiar to anybody? However, anything less than 7 to 8 hours a night consistently will impact your functioning. For example, if you've ever pulled an all-nighter and then didn't do so great on a test the next day, and you were wondering why, a lack of sleep may have contributed. In addition to difficulty concentrating, chronic sleep debt can lead to physical health problems as well. So sleep is important, but how do you improve it? Let's look at the sleep hygiene worksheet on page 12 in your workbook to consider ways to improve your sleep hygiene. Pause now if you need a moment to access the worksheet and resume when you're ready. So, in addition to all of the tips on this worksheet, something else I'd like you to keep in mind is staying away from backlit electronic devices. So this is important because our sleep cycle is tied to light, and this is why we get sleepy when it gets dark outside. When we use backlit electronic devices such as TV, computers, iPads, and so on, two things happen. One, sleep-promoting neurons in the brain are stopped by the artificial light. And two, the nightly release of melatonin, which is the hormone that encourages sleep, is also inhibited. So instead, the light from the electronic device activates neurons that make people more alert. Therefore, it's harder to fall asleep. Sleep experts suggest an electronics curfew, which means refraining from using electronics 60 minutes before going to bed. So please pick one thing from the list on your sleep hygiene worksheet that you'd be willing to try for the next week. Go ahead and highlight it now. We'll check back on that and how that went during the next session. So today we talked about the difference between stress and anxiety, what the anxiety looks like, our physical responses to anxiety, the CBT model for understanding how anxiety works. We learned deep breathing as one tool for managing our anxiety, and we discussed the importance of good sleep hygiene. Next week, we're going to talk more about the CBT model. In particular, we're going to focus on identifying and managing anxious thoughts. Between now and next session, complete one simple cross-sectional diagram using a situation that you experience over the next week, or something that happens to you often. Try to complete the worksheet as soon as possible after the event. If you're unable to do so, jot down a few notes on your phone to review later to prompt yourself to remember what happened. You have multiple blank copies in your workbook, so feel free to complete more than one over the next week. Remember, you can type directly into the appropriate blank spaces in the electronic version of the workbook, so there's no need to print anything. Try at least one per day. It might sound a little overwhelming, but the more you practice, the better you're going to get at using these tools. Also, remember to incorporate your sleep tip and practice deep breathing in your daily life. The deep breathing practice is helpful not only when you're feeling anxious, but it's also helpful in maintaining a calm, clear mind.